Virtual instruments. Sounds pretty cool, hey? It is really cool. Instruments are basically what gets used to create music, right? So an instrument is basically a tool, and a virtual instrument is a digital or electronic version of an instrument. So we can create sounds inside the computer using virtual instruments. Let's first talk about the basic forms of virtual instruments and what we're going to be seeing. The first is called a synthesizer. Now, to synthesize something means to create something new or to combine different parts into a single thing. So synthesizers can create sounds that you can't hear in the real world because they're created electronically. So for instance, the first instrument that we're going to look at inside of Studio One is called MyTie, and it's like a premier, awesome synthesizer that comes bundled with Studio One, and it can create all sorts of crazy sounds, such as this one. And this is a sound that you would never hear in nature, and you can't really make an acoustic instrument that's going to sound like this, though it does have some characteristics that sound a little bit like real instruments. It also sounds totally different in certain ways, and you can really manipulate it. Give all sorts of interesting sounds. So this is what a synthesizer does. Using all these controls, it's able to generate its own sounds and then output them through our headphones or speakers. So this is sort of the first class of virtual instruments and what we're going to be using all the time. They're called synthesizers. Now this synthesizer is called a polyphonic synthesizer. Polyphonic means it can play multiple notes at once. Phonic means sound, poly means multiple. So that means I can hit down a chord with 3 notes and they all ring out at the same time. It's important to know about this because there is sounds, even inside of MyTie, that are monophonic, meaning they can only play 1 note at a time. And sometimes we want that, but sometimes we want to be able to play chords, and then you need to have a polyphonic patch loaded. Now, a patch is just the name for a programming of the synthesizer. It's a preset, it's a sound. So if I go into this top menu here, I see a list of all the patches, all the presets that come built in with MyTie. And in here, there's bass, bell, drums, leads, pads, poly, and poly is the category I'm in right now, which stands for polyphonic, which means that all of these patches can be used for chords. Multiple notes can be played at once on them. So if I'm going to write a chorded part, I'm going to use a polyphonic patch to do it, as opposed to a monophonic patch, which can only play 1 note at a time. Speaking of monophonic, if we move on to our next instrument, called Mojito, Mojito is a monophonic synthesizer. I cannot play more than 1 note at a time. If I hit 3 notes on my keyboard at once, I only hear 1. If I hold a note and then hit another one, it just changes to the new note. So this is actually really useful, especially when you're writing melodies, which we're going to get going with very shortly. And the choice between monophonic and polyphonic synthesizers is an important one that will become clear to you as you start to compose your own music. You have to make this decision. Do I want the sound to be monophonic or polyphonic? Now, Mojito can't be polyphonic. It is only monophonic, where MyTie can choose polyphonic or monophonic. So MyTie is a more advanced synthesizer, but it's also more complicated. When we're looking to make just a very simple sound, Mojito might be the way to go. And in the future, we're going to start using both of these synthesizers to program our own sounds, learning how to make our own synthesizer presets, which will be really fun. Now, the next class of instruments outside of synthesizers is called samplers. Samplers are what we use to recreate real instruments. So if I open this, it's called Presence, another one of the instruments inside Studio One. I've got a piano sound here. So as you can see, that sounds like a real piano. Because it is a real piano. This was actually recorded with microphones by the people at Presonus, and they recorded this piano and then they built the instrument inside of Presence, and when we hit a key, it actually plays back the recorded sample of the real piano. So samplers are how we get real instruments inside of Studio One without having to record them. We can play it with our keyboard. So if we look inside the presets of Presence, we can see we've got bass, brass like trumpets, we've got guitars, keyboards, organs, percussion, strings like violins and cellos, vocals, woodwinds like saxophones, all sorts of real instruments. If we want a real instrument in our song, Presence is the instrument we're going to use to do that. So samplers record real instruments and then play them back to us. And if you get a good patch, a really well-made preset, it can be indiscernible from the real instrument, meaning the average person would be unable to tell the difference between the part that you played on your keyboard using a sampler and a real person playing it on the actual instrument in a recording studio. The other sampler we have inside Studio One is called Sample One. And Sample One is a little bit of a different system. It's not so much meant to recreate real instruments and make them very playable. The way I use it is to load in single samples and then manipulate those samples and do all sorts of cool things with them. So for instance, I loaded in a vocal part of a woman singing, and I just took a little section of it and made a little loop of it, so it sounds like this. Pretty weird, hey? So I can pitch bend it. So you might have heard this kind of thing inside of pop music or electronic music before, and this is really what I use Sample One for. We're going to have some tutorials on Sample One, but if you're looking to use real instruments, Presence is the one to go for. Sample One is a much more specific use in terms of how you're going to use samples in it, and for now I would say it's probably best to stay away from it and spend most of your time with Presence until you understand how it operates. But just so you know, there is 2 samplers inside of Studio One, but Presence is the more advanced one and the best for making emulations of real sounds. The last instrument inside Studio One is called Impact. Impact is also a sampler, but a bit of a different kind. It's actually a drum machine. So we have 16 pads here, and on the pads are loaded drums. And these drums are actually mapped to my keyboard, so I can play. And I'm just using my fingers to play as if I'm on a real drum set. So these 16 pads get mapped across 16 keys. And we can make all kinds of beats with them. This is what we're going to use in the future to make our own drum loops, where we load in drum sounds onto each pad, or we choose a preset from up here, and then we program our own drum beats and make our songs on top of those drum beats instead of using loops. So again, this is a sampler because it's using samples, drum samples, but it's not intended to play pianos and things like that. It's just for drums. So Impact is our drum sampler or drum machine. So one more overview. We have 2 synthesizers. The advanced synthesizer called Mai Tai, which is both polyphonic and monophonic. Mojito, which is only monophonic, much simpler. Presence, which is an advanced sampler. It can play back real sounds and has all sorts of advanced features. Sample One is a much more simple sampler and has specific use cases that we will talk about in the future. And then Impact is what we use for drums. There is one more class of instruments that Studio One does not have, which is called modeling, physical modeling, and that's kind of a method of using synthesis to represent real sounds. And it's using very advanced science, mathematics, and it basically emulates or reconstructs real instruments like pianos and whatever else you want really, digitally without recording any samples. So it's a very advanced kind of synthesis, and they don't have it right now in Studio One, but you don't really need it. We have so many sounds here already. There's nothing to worry about. We're not missing out on anything. And honestly, I don't ever use modeling synths anyway, but I have tried a few of them and they're pretty awesome. So you can check those out on the internet if you want to YouTube them or just look them up. But for now, this is totally sufficient, and we're going to get into depth about how to load these in and everything in the future, but just so you have an overview of what's available to us before we start playing around with that, these are the instruments of Studio One.